Sophia's hands trembled, and her heart pounded so loudly that she was sure everyone on the glimmering yacht could hear it. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, reflecting off the polished floors with a dazzling brilliance that felt cold to her eyes. She stood at the center of a gathering so lavish it bordered on surreal. Elegant gowns, crisp suits, the quiet notes of a string quartet drifting through the night air. Yet beneath all the laughter and ostentatious displays of wealth, there lingered an unspoken tension. One Sophia felt in every guarded look from Claire, her employer. As a sudden hush spread across the deck, Claire's voice sliced through the silence like winter wind. "You think you can play with my guests?" she hissed. "You're nothing without me." The crowd froze. Sophia's cheeks burned under the weight of so many stares. In that instant, she wondered if anyone here could see past her uniform, if they sensed the secrets she carried. Moments earlier, the party had seemed like a different world entirely. Waitstaff whisked past with silver trays of champagne flutes, and bursts of laughter spun around Sophia in dizzying circles. She had done her best to stay invisible, but something about this evening made her skin prickle. Claire's gaze never left her, as though hunting for the slightest misstep. Perhaps it was the thread of shame Claire wielded so easily, or the words Sophia had overheard just before the first guests arrived. "Don't embarrass me," Claire had warned in a clipped tone. Eyes narrowed, the world might have seen Claire as a beacon of poise, her posture impossibly straight, her every move crisp with self-assured elegance. But Sophia caught glimpses of something else behind that polished exterior. Sometimes Claire's stare seemed haunted, as though she too stood on the edge of an inner storm. Yet, in the opening minutes of the evening, that was hardly apparent to the other guests. They saw only a glowing host who mingled effortlessly, her laughter like tinkling glass. In those fleeting intervals, Sophia felt the intensity of Claire's presence gripping her from across the room, reminding her that every slip would be noticed. It wasn't just about serving drinks or tidying up after the affluent. It was about protecting her own dreams. Standing among these finely dressed strangers, she thought to herself, what happens when the glimmer of wealth hides the chill of judgment? Could a single night change everything she believed about who she was and where she belonged? Amid the hum of conversation, Sophia reflected on her hopes. She'd always yearned for a life beyond these parties, far from the glitz that reduced her to a silent server. Her heart ached to do more, to be more. Watching waiters glide by in crisp uniforms, she wondered if they, too, had stories overshadowed by someone else's fortune. In her few quiet moments, she couldn't stop the questions from sneaking in. Did her ambitions even matter here, among people who barely seemed to notice her face? Could she ever break free from these constraints that felt so suffocating? That intangible longing swirled in her thoughts like a gathering storm, one poised to unleash itself in ways even she couldn't predict. She touched her serving tray, taking comfort in the steady coolness of metal against her palm. If only the guests understood that glimmering crystals and smooth champagne were distractions from deeper struggles. She caught sight of Claire's reflection in a window, a statuesque silhouette cloaked in affluence. For all her poise, Claire's eyes were distant, as though she wore her wealth like armor. It struck Sophia that maybe, behind a polished perfection, Claire had her own scars hidden behind a mask of confidence. Just then, a shrill laugh erupted from a circle of guests, snapping Sophia back to her role. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and forced a polite smile. The night was still young, and there was a storm building, a silent promise that secrets would soon unravel. If you're ready to dive into the complexities of privilege and vulnerability, she thought, then be prepared for a story that complicates our notions of empathy. She took a breath, trying to steady her nerves. Something told her the evening's revelations would test everything she believed about herself and about Claire. Under the warm glow of the chandelier, Sophia moved quietly along the deck, collecting empty glasses and tidying overlooked messes. Despite her silent efficiency, she felt each disapproving glance from Claire, who hovered near her wealthy entourage. It was as if Claire was waiting for a single misstep, something to prove that Sophia didn't belong. Sophia tried to ignore the creeping anxiety. She'd learned to keep her head bowed and her expression calm, but inside, her mind churned with her own frustrations and ambitions. She had dreams too, though society often treated them as if they were luxuries meant for someone else. The tension in the air became palpable when Claire's childhood friend arrived. Sophia noticed how this friend eyed Claire with open disapproval. "You can't keep talking down to people," he whispered fiercely when Claire pulled him aside. Sophia overheard fragments of their hushed conversation. "She's your maid, but she's also a human being. You don't deserve to look down on her." Those words thrummed in Sophia's ears like a distant echo of hope, acknowledging her humanity. But Claire's rigid posture never softened. Instead, she squared her shoulders and shot her friend a glare that made it clear she was not ready to back down. For a moment, Sophia allowed a flicker of optimism to ease her guarded heart. She glanced around the deck at the swirling guests, many oblivious to the rising tension. Sure, they indulged in the glamorous setting, cocktails in hand, designer dresses shimmering under the lights, but very few noticed the quiet power struggles unfolding just beneath the surface. Sophia knew her place in this household hinged on her unwavering loyalty, and she'd always delivered that without question. Yet something about Claire's friend's words lingered in her mind. Did she truly have to accept this treatment forever? Sophia felt the yacht lurch slightly as a new arrival stepped aboard. She recognized him from photos in Claire's private quarters. Her ex-boyfriend, a name spoken in whispers whenever Claire was in a certain kind of mood. His presence brought a fresh air of intrigue to the night. At once Sophia sensed Claire tense, like a cat watching a sudden threat. Curiously, though, the ex-boyfriend's attention drifted toward Sophia when she was on her knees, fixing a piece of faulty sound equipment that had caused a slight disturbance in the party music. "You really know what you're doing," he remarked with a half-smile, kneeling beside her. "I didn't expect to see you handling all this technical stuff." She braced herself for an insult, but his voice held genuine respect. There, under the watchful eyes of curious onlookers, Sophia felt a strange flash of validation. "I had to teach myself a few things," she replied quietly, wishing her pulse would slow. The ex-boyfriend's brief admiration only deepened Claire's scowl, fueling that cold jealousy Sophia had sensed all evening. Torn between keeping her head down and daring to acknowledge this unexpected kindness, Sophia managed a small nod of gratitude. She glanced over her shoulder to see Claire's features contorted by anger. Her cheeks flushed. That single moment of noticing her ex showing interest in the maid threatened to unravel the facade Claire had built so meticulously. Sophia felt a pang of apprehension. She was under no illusions. Whatever respect she just garnered could easily provoke a backlash from Claire. It took only minutes for that backlash to erupt. Storming across the deck, Claire cornered Sophia, heedless of the growing crowd around them. Her polished voice was ice-laced fury. "How dare you think you can engage with my guests like you're one of them?" The words spilled out in a venomous rush, eyes glaring with a mix of rage and fear. Sophia's heart thudded, her face flushing beneath the weight of Claire's scorn. She thought back to her own silent struggle. The hours of studying and working, all to support her real purpose in life, one that had nothing to do with clearing tables, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed. Sophia swallowed hard and met Claire's hostile gaze. "You don't know what it means to fight for something," she said softly, voice trembling yet firm, "or what it's like to have doors slammed in your face because of where you come from." A hush fell over the bystanders, some of whom had begun to notice that this argument was more than a minor spat between employer and employee. Claire's glare flickered with something akin to recognition. For a moment, Sophia thought she glimpsed a crack in that cool veneer, a fleeting sign that maybe, just maybe, Claire was tired of holding on to whatever image she thought she had to maintain. But the moment passed quickly. Claire turned to the onlookers, her expression twisting into a mask of indifference. Before Sophia could retreat, though, a wave of dizziness made her sway. She'd rushed earlier in the night to help with a last-minute fiasco in the kitchen, carrying trays of supplies she wasn't used to hefting. And now, the strain caught up with her. The crowd parted slightly as Sophia stumbled, but one person stepped forward to help. To Sophia's surprise, it was Claire's childhood friend, the one who had earlier admonished Claire for her haughty behavior. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, gently stabilizing her elbow. She heard murmurs around them, saw the fleeting glimpses of guests beginning to piece together that this was no simple drama. Beneath the chandelier's glow, she felt exposed, but she also felt a rush of resolve. She had spent too many years keeping her own truth hidden, believing it would protect her. Now, confronted by Claire's anger, she realized she had nothing left to lose. "Maybe it's time they know who I really am," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. When she finally stood up straight, gathering the remnants of her courage, her voice carried across the stunned circle of onlookers. "I'm not just your maid," she said, letting each word ring out. "I fight for people like me, people without voices. When I'm not here, I'm back in my neighborhood, helping organize community centers, distributing food, and giving free tutoring. I don't just serve guests, I serve those who can't afford anything at all." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, and even Claire looked momentarily lost for words. Sophia caught sight of raised eyebrows, whispered conversations, the sudden shift in how they regarded her. She was no longer an invisible background figure. The hush lengthened, broken only by the soft clink of someone setting a glass down. From across the deck, Claire's friend exhaled a quiet breath, as if relieved to hear someone finally speaking truth into this stifling environment. Claire's face grew taut. Sophia couldn't fully read her expression, whether it was anger, shame, or disbelief. But for the first time all evening, Claire didn't launch into a tirade. Instead, she stood there, arms stiff at her sides, while her ex-boyfriend cast a look of admiration in Sophia's direction. "That's impressive," he said softly, earning a hard stare from Claire. Sophia felt her own chest tighten, a mix of trepidation and relief swirling inside her. She'd never intended to declare her mission under such dramatic circumstances, but the secrecy had weighed on her for too long. This was who she was, a dreamer with a cause. Let the onlookers judge. At least they would judge the real her. When the hush finally broke, it wasn't chaos that followed. Rather, a curious stillness spread among the guests. People whispered among themselves, intrigued. Some of the older patrons exchanged pointed looks, as though uncertain how to handle a confrontation that challenged their assumptions. A few seemed impressed, while others looked vaguely disconcerted. Standing amid the glow of the chandelier, Sophia felt something shift, the beginning of a redefined dynamic between her and Claire. Little by little, that tension morphed into a different sort of energy. Claire's childhood friend approached her, quietly offering a few words. Sophia couldn't hear. Claire's brows furrowed, and for a fleeting instant she looked almost vulnerable. Sophia watched, eyes flickering with questions. Had she accidentally forced Claire to confront something she'd buried in her own heart? Time stretched like taffy, each second weighed down by the shared scrutiny of the onlookers. Eventually, Claire cleared her throat. "Sophia," she said, voice subdued. It sounded more like an uncertain attempt at a peace offering. Sophia nodded slowly, resisting the urge to shrink back. "If you're ready to dive deeper into all this, these questions of privilege and empathy, then don't just stand there," Sophia wanted to say to the wide-eyed guests. Instead, she swallowed the sentiment, focusing on Claire, who turned on her heel and began walking toward a quieter corner of the yacht. Sophia followed, ignoring the whispers that surrounded them. They found a secluded spot near the railing, overlooked by flickering lanterns. Sophia leaned against the polished wood, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't want to appear shaken, though her legs still felt a bit weak. Claire stood beside her, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the dark water below. A few moments passed in silence, the hush broken only by the gentle lap of waves against the hull. "You made me look weak," Claire began, but her voice lacked the usual bite. There was a tremor in it that Sophia had never heard before. "This party was supposed to show everyone how capable I am." Sophia exhaled slowly, her eyes drifting over the distant shoreline lights. "Maybe your strength doesn't come from being above everyone else," she ventured. "It comes from lifting others up. Doesn't that make you more powerful than hurting people?" Claire flinched, as though Sophia's words were a direct hit on some unspoken wound. Silence hung thick in the night air, and Sophia wondered whether she had gone too far. She was merely the help, after all. Did she really have the standing to talk to Claire like this? Yet a strange feeling of relief came over her. For too long, she'd only responded with a bowed head. Tonight, after everything, that habit had been shattered. Claire turned slightly, letting her gaze fall on Sophia. Up close, her posture wavered, shoulders slumping a fraction. "It's not easy," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes, It feels like I've been living a life I never chose." Her voice grew softer, laced with fatigue. "People have expectations of me. My family, my social circle, and I guess I acted out of fear. Fear of failing in their eyes." Sophia studied the woman before her, trying to reconcile this subdued figure with the imperious host of just an hour ago. "I know what it's like to carry burdens you didn't ask for," she said gently. "My mother died when I was young, and I had to work to support my younger siblings. People looked down on me for my background, and I promised myself I'd prove them wrong one day." They stood together in silence, the only sound the faint chatter of the party drifting from another part of the yacht. Sophia couldn't deny the swirl of emotions coiling in her stomach, tentative sympathy for someone she had resented for so long, and the caution of a person who knew how quickly illusions could shatter. When Claire spoke again, her voice was nearly lost amid the sea breeze. "I never meant to humiliate you," she murmured. "It's just, you were good at everything I never bothered to learn. People like my ex started noticing you more than me, and I panicked." Sophia recalled the ex-boyfriend's mild flirtation, more an expression of genuine curiosity than a romantic overture. Still, it had been enough to spark something in Claire she couldn't control. "Maybe you were threatened," Sophia ventured, "because you saw your own potential in me." She paused, letting the thought linger. "You used to have dreams of making a difference, right? I've seen your old books and notes. I've come across them when cleaning your study." A flicker of surprise crossed Claire's features, followed by the ghost of a smile. "You saw those?" she asked, voice tight. When Sophia nodded, Claire exhaled. "I used to want to be someone who helped others. My father was big in business. He told me I was foolish, that my job was to keep the family's legacy safe." Sophia softened. "It's not too late to remember what you wanted for yourself," she said. "Sometimes we bury our ambitions because we think it'll keep us safe. But life doesn't feel right when you're living in fear of other people's judgment." Somewhere behind them, the party was winding down, or maybe it was just drifting into a calmer rhythm after the confrontation. One by one, guests found new distractions to occupy them, but a handful still watched Claire and Sophia, curious whether the night's drama would escalate or transform into something else entirely. A subtle shift in Claire's eyes told Sophia that something was clicking into place. As if for the first time, she recognized how she and Sophia were not so different. Both had navigated a world of rigid expectations, though from opposite ends of the social ladder. One fought to break the chains of poverty, the other to escape the rigid confines of wealth and pride. In the quiet that followed, Claire cleared her throat. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice halting. "I never asked about your life. I assumed you were just content to clean up my messes." Sophia nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology. "Maybe I was content not to talk because I wanted to protect my own ambitions. I run a small program back home, tutoring kids whose parents can't afford to send them to private schools. I've been applying for grants. I thought if you knew, you'd think less of me, or assume I was only with your family to get something out of you." Claire's brow furrowed. "I had no idea." Sophia offered a faint, apologetic smile. "Now you do." They stood there for a moment, both uncertain how to proceed. Two people who had been locked in a power dynamic for so long, now finding themselves on unexpectedly level ground. Eventually, Claire's friend drifted over, glancing between them with a tentative smile. "You two good?" he asked quietly. Claire looked to Sophia, then back to him. "I think we will be," she said, not entirely confident, but at least more honest than before. Long after the sky began to lighten, the aftermath of that confrontation clung to the air. Sophia felt an unexpected sense of liberation. The lines between them had changed. Claire stayed near her, not as an adversary, but almost as a companion. The conversation turned to real questions about what Sophia did in her community. Guests who had once overlooked the invisible help paused to ask her about her work. In those gentle, curious exchanges, Sophia sensed the start of something bigger. She saw respect dawning in people's eyes. A slow, cautious bond formed between her and Claire, though neither dared call it friendship just yet. Still, it was a shift, an acknowledgement that life was not simply about the roles they played at these parties, but about the people they chose to be. Over the next few months, this fragile sense of connection blossomed in ways Sophia never anticipated. Claire, began showing up at local community events, donating not just money, but time. She quietly sat in on a few tutoring sessions, absorbing the struggles and successes that colored Sophia's world. Meanwhile, Sophia took steps to formalize her advocacy, applying for partnerships and grants that required some social leverage. Leverage Claire offered by tapping into her network of affluent friends. Of course, rumors swirled. People in Claire's circles whispered about how the heiress had grown oddly fond of her maid. Yet over coffee tables and dinner gatherings, the story evolved into something inspiring. It turned out that bridging differences could captivate even those who prided themselves on the status quo. Before long, their collaboration drew public attention. Claire was invited onto boards of local charities, while Sophia found herself leading training workshops for volunteers who never would have noticed her otherwise. For Sophia, it felt surreal to navigate these new spaces, no longer just the help, but a partner in driving community initiatives. Though she had once worried that revealing her personal mission would jeopardize her job, the opposite occurred. She felt more self-assured than ever, speaking confidently about her passion for educational equity. She often recalled that night on the yacht and how everything had come to a head with Claire's harsh words. Sometimes she still felt that sting, but she also remembered that was the moment she finally stood up for herself and discovered an ally she'd never expected. By the time spring rolled around, it was clear that something had changed within Claire as well. Where once she obsessed over the perfect party, she now spoke animatedly about attending local council meetings, forging a path that aligned with the idealistic dreams she'd once buried under her father's expectations. Sophia spotted a genuine spark in Claire's eyes whenever talk turned to helping those in need. It was as if that confrontation on the yacht had shattered a mirror Claire had been holding up to the world, revealing a far more authentic self beneath the shattered glass. Late one afternoon, Sophia and Claire met in a modest community center lounge, a far cry from the lavish yacht that had brought their initial clash into full view. Sunlight flooded the room through tall windows, illuminating shelves of books that local kids used for after-school tutoring. Claire trailed her fingers along the spines, reading the titles aloud and smiling to herself. "You know," Claire said softly, turning to Sophia, "I used to think wealth was everything. Power, protection, validation. But this," she swept an arm around the room, "feels more real than any party I've thrown." Sophia set down a stack of worksheets. "I'm glad you can see the difference," she said. "When we lift other people up, we realize our own strength in a new way." Claire returned her gaze. "All this time, I was so scared of looking inferior, or losing the approval of people I don't even like. I never stopped to think about how I could use what I have to make a real difference." Sophia's thoughts drifted back to that night. She remembered Claire's trembling fury, the cruel words that had once stung like a slap. Yet here they were, forging a new path, one built on mutual respect. It wasn't a perfect friendship. There were still traces of old patterns, occasional flare-ups of suspicion or impatience. But with each passing week, both of them grew, letting empathy replace the judgments that once defined their roles. The story of their transformation spread beyond the community center walls. Local newspapers picked it up. Heiress partners with former Maid to serve local youth. People who had never cared about charity cases found themselves intrigued by the unusual alliance. Volunteer numbers surged. Donations poured in. The local kids, who had long struggled with limited resources, suddenly had opportunities that had felt like distant dreams just months before. Claire's father remained skeptical, sometimes urging her to keep a tighter leash on finances, but it was clear she no longer lived in fear of his censure. As for Sophia, the new partnerships allowed her to expand her program, bringing in mentors and launching extracurricular classes. Slowly, the two women's efforts began to shift how their broader social circles viewed the class divide, at least in small ways. Occasionally, Claire's ex-boyfriend dropped by to help, setting aside his own social ambitions for an afternoon of volunteering. Sophia still felt his watchful gaze and noticed the flickers of admiration in his eyes, but she had come to realize that her own path wasn't defined by a potential romantic entanglement or by any single person's approval. Her satisfaction came from leading children in reading sessions, seeing their eyes brighten when they finally grasped a tricky concept, and from watching families find new hope. On a mild summer evening, the two women reconvened in Claire's garden, where they were hosting a small fundraising event. Nothing like the grandiose parties of the past. The soft notes of acoustic music hummed in the background, and the chatter of guests was subdued, focused on shared causes rather than ostentatious displays of wealth. Standing at the edge of the lantern-lit lawn, Sophia and Claire exchanged a meaningful look. A year ago, such a scene would have been unimaginable. Tonight, it felt like the culmination of all their private struggles and whispered dreams. Claire cleared her throat, glancing at the small crowd. "Welcome, everyone," she began, speaking in a measured tone. "You are here because you believe in something bigger than yourselves. When we come together, we see that status isn't what defines us. Our capacity to lift each other up does." The evening ended on a hopeful note, with generous pledges toward the community programs Sophia and Claire had worked so hard to develop. As the last guests filtered out, the two women found themselves alone by a row of rose bushes. The hush of night wrapped around them, and for a moment, they simply breathed in the perfume of blooming flowers. Claire turned to Sophia, her expression open. "I can't believe how much has changed since that night." Sophia managed a small laugh. "Change can happen when you finally speak your truth, even if it starts with the worst possible confrontation in front of half the city." She paused, remembering the sting of that public humiliation, the anger in Claire's voice, and yet that bitterness had given way to an unlikely alliance. Claire's gaze flicked upward at the scattered stars overhead. "I used to think wealth was my shield, but it was really my cage." She glanced at Sophia with a grateful smile. "You helped me see that. I hope you know how strong you are." Sophia felt her chest swell with a gentle warmth. "I'm beginning to see that, and I'm also starting to believe that real strength isn't something we keep to ourselves. It's something we share." Night deepened, and they parted ways with the comfort of a steady friendship forming. In the days that followed, that sense of unity continued to ripple outward. People around them noted how two individuals from starkly different worlds had found common ground. The story circulated on social media, prompting discussions about privilege, empathy, and the possibility of bridging divides that once seemed impassable. Sophia often found herself remembering a line she'd read somewhere. "In a world that so often divides us, what bonds us is not our status, but our capacity for kindness." She saw truth in those words every time she taught a child the alphabet or handed out a scholarship application. And in Claire's unguarded smiles, she witnessed a reflection of the same idea, that understanding another person's struggle could dismantle walls no amount of money could ever breach. Looking back, the humiliation she'd suffered on that yacht felt both distant and essential. Without that painful spark, she might never have spoken her truth. Without Claire's outburst, Claire herself might never have faced what she had long hidden behind designer dresses and carefully curated parties. Their confrontation had been the catalyst that stripped away illusions, forcing both to stand on equal ground. Standing in front of a modest mirror one morning, preparing for a day of tutoring, Sophia let a small smile lift the corners of her mouth. She felt renewed. The city outside her window bustled with noise, but it no longer felt so imposing. For the first time in her life, she believed her work carried enough weight to reshape not just her future, but the futures of countless people. That afternoon, she walked into a community meeting to find Claire already seated, flipping through notes about new educational initiatives. Claire looked up, smiling in recognition. No words needed to pass between them in that instant. The calm in their eyes spoke of how far they had come, and of the uncharted territory still ahead, where both of them could keep evolving. It was true. They had once stood on opposite sides of a stark divide, rich girl and poor maid, each holding assumptions about the other. But the night of that party had proven that humility and empathy could bridge even the widest chasm. If you're ready to reflect on these complexities of privilege and vulnerability, then consider how easily judgments can blind us to shared humanity. After all, real wealth, they discovered, doesn't shine in chandeliers or gleam in expensive attire. It grows through compassion, understanding, and the courage to see the person behind the status. As a gentle sunset washed the city skyline in a haze of gold, Sophia and Claire stepped out of the community meeting side by side. A handful of passers-by glanced their way, perhaps puzzled by the sight of a wealthy heiress and a one-time maid conversing like old friends. But neither woman paid any mind to the onlookers. They simply walked forward with matching smiles, ready to shape a world where hearts, not bank accounts, define one's true value. And for those watching, the message rang clear. In any world that often pits us against each other, the greatest secret lies in discovering how powerfully we can transform one another's lives through empathy, sincerity, and the resolve to break free. Chains of prejudice. If you're moved by stories that challenge the surface of social divides, remember to offer your voice to causes that unite us, because the next time you see someone overshadowed by status or misunderstood due to their station, you might be witnessing the beginning of a transformation, one that reveals how even the greatest gaps can be bridged by a single shared moment of truth.